The Texas Hill Country is a particular kind of American landscape. It is characterized by rolling hills, limestone formations, cedar and oak forests, winding rivers and streams. It is a region of natural beauty, but it is also a region of isolation. The Hill Country is rural. Population density is low. Towns are far apart. Highways cut through vast stretches of relatively undeveloped land. The Hill Country landscape was shaped by geological processes extending back millions of years. The terrain consists of limestone hills that were formed from ancient seabeds. The vegetation adapted to this rocky, semi-arid environment. Cedar and oak trees are predominant. The landscape is dotted with limestone outcroppings, dramatic valleys, and winding rivers that cut through the hills. In 1976, the Texas Hill Country was even more isolated than it is today. Roads were less developed. Cell phones did not exist. Communication between rural areas and towns was limited. If a person became stranded or encountered trouble on a hill country highway, assistance might take significant time to arrive. The infrastructure for rapid response to emergency situations was not in place. The landscape of the hill country is beautiful, but also somewhat forbidding. The terrain is hilly and rocky. The vegetation is dense in many areas. The visibility from the roads can be limited. Roads wind through the landscape, sometimes with sharp turns and elevation changes. The landscape seems almost designed to conceal things, to hide secrets, to swallow evidence. During the day, the hill country landscape is relatively open and visible, but at night, particularly in 1976, when there was minimal artificial lighting along rural highways, the landscape becomes dark and mysterious. The darkness is profound. The sense of isolation is complete. A person traveling through the hill country at night in 1976 would have felt very much alone, very distant from civilization. This is the landscape through which 5 teenagers drove on the night of May 15, 1976. This is the environment that would, in the hours and days following their departure, become the focus of an intensive search that would ultimately fail to locate them. The 5 teenagers who disappeared that night were not random individuals. They were known, loved, cared for. They were part of a high school community, a family network, a social circle that would be permanently disrupted by their disappearance. Each teenager was an individual with a unique history, unique characteristics, unique dreams for the future. James Edward Mitchell was the oldest of the 5, 18 years old. He was a senior at Central Hill Country High School. He was popular, athletic, a starting player on the school's basketball team. James was 6'2", with an athletic build that came from years of serious athletic training. He was handsome in the way that teenage athletes often are, confident, physically assured, aware of his own attractiveness. James came from a family of means. His father, Edward Mitchell Sr., was a successful businessman who had built a construction company that operated throughout Central Texas. His mother, Patricia Mitchell, was a teacher at the high school where James studied. The Mitchell family lived in a large, well-appointed house on the outskirts of their small town. James had been given material advantages. He had always had enough money, had access to good education, had been able to pursue his athletic interests. James had been accepted to the University of Texas at Austin to study engineering. He had excellent grades, scoring well on standardized tests. He was planning to major in civil engineering, following a path that he believed would lead to financial success and professional achievement. But James was also a teenager with typical teenage concerns and teenage psychology. He was in love with Sarah Henderson. He had hopes and anxieties about the future. He was looking forward to the prom, to the celebration of his final year of high school, to the transition to adulthood that was about to begin. Sarah Marie Henderson was 17 years old, the second oldest of the group. She was James's girlfriend. They had been dating for approximately 2 years, having met at a school dance during their sophomore year. Sarah was James's romantic partner, his emotional connection, his closest friend. Sarah was academically accomplished, a member of the National Honor Society. She had a quiet, thoughtful personality. She was not particularly athletic, but she had interests and talents in the arts. She played violin and was involved in the school orchestra. She participated in the school choir and in various musical performances. Sarah came from a family that valued education and intellectual engagement. Her father was a lawyer, her mother was a social worker. The Henderson family was well-educated, cultured, involved in the community. Sarah had been exposed to ideas and perspectives that went beyond the typical small-town environment. Sarah had been accepted to Rice University in Houston, one of the most prestigious universities in Texas. She was planning to major in music with a focus on music performance and theory. She had dreams of possibly pursuing graduate education and a career in music education or performance. Sarah and James were the perfect teenage couple, academically successful, attractive, part of the school's social elite. Their relationship was serious in the way that teenage relationships can be. They spent most of their time together. They planned their futures together. They had discussed the possibility of eventually marrying. Michael Antonio Torres was 17 years old, one of the middle-aged teenagers in the group. Michael was the child of immigrant parents from Mexico. His father, Antonio Torres, had come to the United States in the 1950s, finding work in construction. His mother, Rosa Torres, had come to the United States in the late 1950s and had worked in various housekeeping and domestic positions. Michael's parents had instilled in him the importance of education and hard work. They had emphasized that education was the path to a better life, to opportunities that had not been available to them. Michael had taken these lessons to heart. He was a good student, an athlete, well liked by his peers. He had learned Spanish from his parents but was fully bilingual, speaking English with an American accent and Spanish with the accent of his parents' region. Michael had dreams of becoming a police officer or a firefighter. He was interested in helping people and in serving his community. He had the personality and temperament that would have been well suited to either profession. He was level-headed, had good judgment, was respected by his peers as someone who could be trusted. Michael had been accepted to attend community college with the plan of transferring to a 4-year university after completing his general education requirements. He did not have the financial resources that some of his peers had, but he had determination and a clear sense of direction. Michael was proud of his heritage. He was proud of his parents' accomplishments in immigrating to the United States and building a life. He understood that his opportunities were built on the foundation of his parents' hard work and sacrifice. Lisa Ann Garrett was 18 years old, one of the oldest members of the group. She came from a ranching family. Her parents owned a significant amount of land in the hill country and ran cattle operations. The Garrett family was financially secure, though their wealth came from agricultural operations rather than from professional careers. Lisa was strong-willed and independent. She had grown up on a ranch, had learned to ride horses, had participated in agricultural work. She had a natural leadership quality. She was elected to the school's student government as a junior and was expected to run for higher positions in her senior year. Lisa was interested in environmental conservation and in sustainable ranching practices. She had ideas about how her family's ranch could be operated in ways that were more environmentally conscious. She had dreams of potentially taking over the ranch management and implementing her ideas. Lisa was physically strong, capable, athletic. She participated in various school activities, but was not particularly focused on academics in the way that some of her peers were. Her intelligence was more practical and applied than theoretical. She understood systems, understood how things worked, understood people. David Michael Chen was 17 years old, the youngest of the 5 teenagers. He was the child of recently immigrated parents from Taiwan. His father, Dr. David Chen Sr., was a physician who had emigrated to the United States to pursue medical training and had remained to establish a medical practice. His mother, Dr. Lisa Chen, was a pharmacist who had also emigrated from Taiwan and had established herself in her profession. David was intellectually gifted. He was particularly talented in mathematics and physics. He had spent significant time preparing for standardized tests and had achieved excellent scores. He had been accepted to several universities, including Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, California Institute of Technology, Caltech, and Stanford University. He represented extraordinary intellectual promise. David's parents had high expectations for their son. They had immigrated to provide opportunities for their family, and they expected David to take advantage of those opportunities. David understood the weight of his parents' expectations. He understood that much of their sacrifice had been made so that he could have a better life, better opportunities, better education than they had had. David was somewhat socially awkward in the way that intellectually gifted teenagers sometimes are. He did not have the natural social ease that some of his peers had, but he had developed close friendships with people who appreciated his intelligence and his dry sense of humor. He was not popular in the way that James Mitchell was popular, but he was liked and respected by the people who knew him well. The 5 together. These 5 teenagers were friends. They had developed a social connection. They spent time together at school, at social events, at various school-related activities. They had a genuine affection for each other. They were the kind of friend group that seemed to have found each other almost accidentally, but that had developed a real bond. The group represented diversity in socioeconomic background, in family origin, in interests and talents, but they had found common ground in their friendship. They supported each other. They spent their free time together. They had made plans to attend prom together as a group. None of the 5 teenagers had any way of knowing that the night of May 15, 1976, would be different from any other night. None had any indication that they were about to be caught in a sequence of events that would result in their complete disappearance, their bodies never recovered, their fate remaining unknown for the next 50 years. Central Hill Country High School was located in a small town in the Texas Hill Country. The school served students from a wide geographic area, as the school district covered a large rural region. The school building was constructed in the 1960s, a typical mid-century American high school structure. Brick construction, linear layout, functional design. The school had an enrollment of approximately 800 students in 1976. The student body was predominantly white, but there was increasing diversity, particularly with families from Mexico and other immigrant backgrounds. The school reflected the broader demographic changes occurring in rural Texas during the 1970s. The faculty at Central Hill Country High School was dedicated. Teachers were committed to education and to serving their students. The school had a reputation for academic rigor. Athletic programs were important to the school's identity. Sports, particularly football and basketball, were central to the school's culture and to the community's identification with the school. The senior class of 1976 consisted of approximately 200 students. The class was diverse in socioeconomic background, in family structure, in educational achievement, and in personal characteristics. The class represented the full spectrum of American teenage society, from wealthy ranching families to working-class families to immigrant families. The school's prom was a significant event in the school's social calendar. The prom was traditionally held in May, toward the end of the school year. The event celebrated the completion of the high school experience. For students attending prom, it was a significant rite of passage, a formal event that marked a transition from high school to the adult world. The school's administration and faculty viewed prom as an important tradition. Precautions were taken to ensure that prom was a safe and appropriate event, but the school had no way of knowing that 5 of its students would not return from prom. The school had no way of knowing that the night of May 15, 1976, would become forever associated with tragedy and mystery. The morning of May 15, 1976, was like any other day in the Texas Hill Country in May. The weather was warm, typical for the region. The day was clear and sunny. The landscape was in full spring, with new growth on trees and plants, wildflowers blooming in fields and along roadsides. For the 5 teenagers who would later disappear, the day was filled with anticipation and excitement. Prom night was approaching. The teenagers had been looking forward to the event for weeks. They had made preparations. They had coordinated what they would wear. They had made plans about the evening. James Mitchell spent the morning with his family. His mother, Patricia, had taken James to get his hair cut. She had made sure that his suit was pressed and ready. She had reminded him about being home by 1 a.m. She had given him money for the evening and for any incidentals that might arise. Sarah Henderson spent the morning preparing. She had gone to a salon to have her hair done. Her mother had helped her select her prom dress and had made sure that the dress was perfectly fitted and pressed. Sarah had tried on her dress multiple times, wanting to look perfect for the evening. She had been excited, had discussed the evening with her parents, had felt the full weight of anticipation. Michael Torres had worked his part-time job that morning, working in a restaurant kitchen. He had earned money to pay for his portion of the evening. He had been proud that he was able to contribute financially to the evening, rather than relying entirely on his parents to fund his attendance. Lisa Garrett had spent the morning helping on the family ranch. She had completed her regular chores. Then she had gone home and prepared for the evening. She had put on her dress and had styled her hair. She had felt the mixture of excitement and the natural social nervousness that precedes a significant social event. David Chen had spent the morning studying. He had an examination coming up in his advanced physics class, and he had wanted to make sure that his studies were maintained despite the excitement of prom. He had studied in the morning and then had prepared for the evening. He had showered and had put on his suit. By afternoon, all 5 teenagers were ready. They were dressed. They were excited. The evening was beginning. The senior prom at Central Hill Country High School was held at an event center located in a small town approximately 25 miles from the rural area where most of the school's students lived. The event center was a professional facility that was rented for various community events. It had been decorated for prom by the school's prom committee and parent volunteers. The decorations transformed the event center into an elegant space, suitable for formal dancing and socializing. The theme for the 1976 prom was Enchanted Evening. Decorations included strings of lights, floral arrangements, fabrics draped from the ceiling, and various props that suggested elegance and romance. Music was provided by a local band that was popular among the high school demographic. The band was called the Nightingales and was known for playing popular music from the era. Songs by contemporary artists like the Eagles, Fleetwood Mac, Bee Gees, and other artists who were popular in 1976. The prom began at 8 p.m. on the evening of May 15, 1976. Students and their dates began arriving at the event center. Chaperones were present to supervise the event. The event was held to ensure that prom was safe and appropriate. Alcohol and drugs were not permitted. The 5 teenagers arrived together at the prom. They had coordinated their arrival time. They entered the event center together. They took photographs together. Formal photographs that would document their attendance at prom. The evening proceeded according to the typical prom format. Students danced, participated in various activities, socialized with their friends and dates. There was a prom court ceremony, during which the prom king and queen were announced. There was a formal dance, during which couples moved slowly to the music. There were refreshments provided: punch, cookies, various snacks. By all accounts, the prom was a successful event. The teenagers who attended seemed to be having a good time. There were no reports of any unusual incidents or problems. The mood was festive, celebratory, filled with the particular excitement and emotion that characterizes a high school prom. The 5 teenagers were among those having a good time. James and Sarah danced together, as did the other couples who had dates. Michael, Lisa, and David danced with friends, participated in the group activities. They were visible, present, engaged with the evening. As midnight approached, the prom concluded. The band played the final song at approximately 11:20 p.m. The teenagers began to prepare to leave. By 11:30 p.m., most of the teenagers who had attended prom had departed from the event center, either with their parents who had come to pick them up, or driving themselves, or being driven by other teenagers. The 5 teenagers loaded into James Mitchell's 1973 Ford Galaxy. James was the driver. Sarah sat in the front passenger seat next to James. Michael, Lisa, and David sat in the back seat. The car was large, a full-size American vehicle from the 1970s. The 5 teenagers fit comfortably in the vehicle. By approximately 11:40 p.m., the 5 teenagers were driving away from the prom venue, heading back toward their homes in the hill country. The route from the prom venue back to the teenagers' homes took them through Highway 281, a rural state highway that cuts through the Texas hill country. Highway 281 connects various small towns in the region. In 1976, Highway 281 was a relatively quiet road, particularly late at night when there was minimal traffic. The route was approximately 35-40 miles in distance. The drive would normally take approximately 45 minutes to 1 hour, depending on traffic conditions, road conditions, and the exact location where each teenager lived. The teenagers were driving late at night, so traffic would be minimal or non-existent. Highway 281 in the hill country passes through beautiful but isolated landscape. The road winds through hills and valleys. There are dense vegetation areas, particularly cedar and oak forests. There are also areas where the landscape opens up, where there are ranches and grazing land. The road is not heavily populated. There are relatively few houses along the road. There are few businesses. There are few other vehicles, particularly late at night. In 1976, there was minimal artificial lighting along Highway 281. There were no streetlights. There were no convenience stores with illuminated signs. The darkness at night would have been profound. The sense of isolation would have been complete. As James Mitchell drove north on Highway 281, leaving the town where the prom had been held, the landscape gradually became more rural, more forested, more isolated. The teenagers were driving through the heart of the Texas hill country, through landscape that was beautiful during the day, but that seemed somewhat forbidding at night. The 5 teenagers were driving home from what had been a positive, successful evening. They were together in a vehicle. They were friends. They were probably discussing the prom, discussing the evening, anticipating arriving home. They had no reason to believe that anything unusual was about to happen. What happened during the drive home remains completely unknown. No one knows what the 5 teenagers experienced. No one knows what they encountered. No one knows why they disappeared. The drive should have taken approximately 45 minutes to 1 hour. If the teenagers had left the prom venue at approximately 11:40 p.m., they should have been arriving home at approximately 12:25 a.m. to 12:40 a.m. But the 5 teenagers never arrived home. Their parents, waiting for them, began to realize that something was wrong. James Mitchell had told his parents that he would be home by 1 a.m. When he had not arrived by 1:30 a.m., his parents began to be concerned. When he had still not arrived by 2 a.m., his parents knew that something was wrong. The parents of the other 4 teenagers were similarly realizing that their children had not arrived home when expected. By 2:08 a.m. on the morning of May 16, 1976, all 5 families were becoming concerned. By 3:08 a.m., they were becoming frightened. By 4:08 a.m., parents were calling each other, trying to determine whether their teenagers had all traveled together and whether they had perhaps stopped somewhere. The parents learned that the 5 teenagers had attended prom together and had all left together in James Mitchell's vehicle. The parents learned that the teenagers had not arrived at any of their homes. The parents began to suspect that the teenagers might have had an accident. Early on the morning of May 16, 1976, approximately 9 to 10 hours after the teenagers should have arrived home, a vehicle was spotted on Highway 281 by a person traveling the road. The vehicle was parked on the shoulder of the highway. The vehicle appeared to be abandoned. The person who spotted the vehicle was concerned about what they saw and called the police. Police were dispatched to investigate. When police arrived at the location, they confirmed that the vehicle was a 1973 Ford Galaxy, matching the description of the vehicle that James Mitchell was driving. The vehicle was indeed abandoned. The doors were locked. The keys were still in the ignition. The engine had been turned off, but the teenagers were not in the vehicle. The car was completely empty. Police immediately recognized the severity of the situation. 5 teenagers, all reported missing by their families, and their vehicle had been found abandoned on a remote highway. This was not a minor situation. This was a serious emergency requiring immediate response. Police called for backup. Additional officers were dispatched to the scene. A perimeter was established around the vehicle. Forensic specialists were called to examine the vehicle. Forensic specialists arrived at the scene and began a detailed examination of James Mitchell's 1973 Ford Galaxy. The goal was to determine whether there was evidence of violence, evidence of what had happened to the 5 teenagers. The vehicle itself was examined carefully. The exterior of the vehicle was examined for any signs of damage or impact. The vehicle showed no evidence of having been in an accident. The paint and body were intact. The windows were not broken. The vehicle was not damaged in any way. The doors were examined. The doors were locked from the outside, requiring that they be opened by key or by breaking glass. This detail was significant. It suggested that either the teenagers had exited the vehicle and then locked it, which would require that they had used the manual locks before exiting, or someone else had locked the vehicle after the teenagers had exited. The interior of the vehicle was examined. The steering wheel was examined for fingerprints. The windows and door handles were examined. Various surfaces were examined for evidence. Clothing was found inside the vehicle. Items of clothing that had apparently been discarded or removed by the teenagers were present in the back seat. The clothing was photographed and documented. Personal possessions were found inside the vehicle. A purse was discovered, belonging to one of the female teenagers. Various personal items were present. These items were photographed and documented. The vehicle's gas tank was examined. The vehicle still had a significant amount of fuel. The vehicle had not run out of gas. The vehicle could have continued for several hundred more miles without needing to refuel. While forensic specialists examined the vehicle itself, other police officers and rescue personnel began searching the area surrounding the vehicle. The goal was to locate any evidence of the teenagers, any sign of where they had gone. The area surrounding the vehicle was largely forested, with dense vegetation. The landscape was hilly. The terrain was rough. Searching the area would be difficult and time-consuming. Police and search and rescue teams spread out through the surrounding hill country landscape, looking for any sign of the teenagers. They called out the teenagers' names. They looked for any physical evidence, clothing, personal items, anything that might indicate where the teenagers had gone. Approximately 3 miles from the vehicle, in a wooded area off the highway, a shoe was discovered. The shoe was carefully documented and photographed. The shoe was identified as belonging to one of the teenagers. Specific identification established through unique markings and characteristics on the shoe. The shoe appeared to have been worn. It was not a new shoe, but a shoe that had been regularly worn. The shoe was a single shoe, not a pair. Only one shoe was found. This was highly unusual. It suggested that the teenager to whom the shoe belonged had walked or had been carried approximately 3 miles from the vehicle. But why only the shoe? Why not both shoes? Why had the shoe been left behind? This discovery was highly significant. It provided evidence that at least one of the teenagers had traveled away from the vehicle. It provided evidence that the teenagers had not simply disappeared from the vehicle in some inexplicable way, but had apparently left the vehicle and had traveled into the surrounding landscape. But it raised as many questions as it answered. Where was the teenager who had worn the shoe? Where were the other 4 teenagers? What had caused the teenagers to leave the vehicle and to travel into the rough hill country landscape? The discovery of the abandoned vehicle and the shoe, combined with the information that 5 teenagers were missing, prompted one of the most intensive search efforts in Texas history to that point. Search and rescue personnel were called to the scene. The number of searchers expanded. By the afternoon of May 16th, there were dozens of searchers in the field. By May 17th, there were over 100 searchers. By May 18th, the number of searchers had expanded to several hundred. Search teams combed through the hill country landscape systematically. They searched through forests. They searched through valleys. They searched through ravines. They used dogs trained to track missing persons. They used helicopters and aircraft to search from above. They organized grid searches, dividing the area into sections, and systematically searching each section. Law enforcement agencies from multiple counties were involved in the search. The Texas Rangers became involved. The FBI was contacted regarding the disappearance of 5 teenagers. Media coverage of the case expanded dramatically. Newspapers ran stories about the missing teenagers. Television stations broadcast news about the search effort. The story became a significant news event, not just in Texas, but nationally. The families of the teenagers were heavily involved in the search effort. They participated in search parties. They distributed flyers with photographs of their children. They spoke to media. They appealed to the public for information. The community rallied around the families. Volunteers showed up to participate in the search effort. Local businesses provided food and supplies for the searchers. The search effort became a community mobilization to try to find the 5 missing teenagers. But despite the intensive search effort, despite the hundreds of searchers, despite the use of aircraft and dogs and systematic searching, no additional trace of the 5 teenagers was found. No bodies were discovered. No additional clothing or personal items were found. The single shoe that had been discovered was the only physical evidence of the teenagers' fate. After several weeks of intensive searching, the search effort was gradually reduced. The authorities concluded that if the teenagers were in the hill country landscape and had been for this long, the probability of finding them alive was minimal. The search shifted from a rescue effort to an investigation into what might have happened. As the investigation into the disappearance of the 5 teenagers proceeded, various theories emerged attempting to explain what had happened. Theory 1: mechanical failure and abandonment. One theory was that the vehicle had broken down. The theory suggested that perhaps the engine had stalled, or the vehicle had experienced some kind of mechanical failure, and the teenagers had attempted to walk for help. But this theory encountered significant obstacles. Police inspection of the vehicle found no evidence of mechanical problems. The vehicle appeared to be in good working order. The engine could be started. The vehicle's mechanical systems appeared to be functioning normally. If the vehicle had broken down, it should have shown evidence of the mechanical failure. Additionally, if the vehicle had broken down, the teenagers would logically have remained with the vehicle or would have walked to the nearest house to seek help. Walking 3 miles into rough hill country terrain did not fit the pattern of teenagers seeking help after a vehicle breakdown. Theory 2: abduction and kidnapping. A second theory was that the teenagers had been abducted. The theory suggested that perhaps another vehicle had pulled alongside the teenagers' vehicle, and individuals in the other vehicle had forced the teenagers to abandon their vehicle and to go with them. But this theory also encountered significant obstacles. Abductions typically involve struggle and altercation. One would expect to find evidence of such struggle: broken windows, torn clothing, signs of physical confrontation. But no such evidence was found. The vehicle was undamaged. The interior showed no signs of struggle. Additionally, an abduction of 5 teenagers at once would be a complex operation. It would require that the perpetrators have a way to transport 5 teenagers. It would require coordination and planning. While not impossible, this scenario seemed unlikely given the evidence. Theory 3. Voluntary disappearance. A third theory was that the teenagers had deliberately planned to disappear. The theory suggested that perhaps the teenagers had decided to run away, to abandon their lives, to start anew somewhere else. The theory suggested that the vehicle had been deliberately abandoned, the doors locked, and the teenagers had walked away together. But this theory seemed highly unlikely. All 5 teenagers came from families with strong attachments. All 5 had promising futures ahead of them. All 5 had been accepted to universities and had plans for their education. It seemed illogical that all 5 would simultaneously decide to abandon their lives. Additionally, if the teenagers had run away together, they would likely have tried to stay together, particularly during a walk through rough terrain at night. It was difficult to explain why only one shoe had been found. Theory 4. Foul play and murder. A fourth theory was that the teenagers had encountered individuals with malicious intent. The theory suggested that perhaps the teenagers had picked up a hitchhiker, or had encountered someone on the highway who had committed violence against them. The theory suggested that perhaps the teenagers had been murdered, and their bodies had been hidden or disposed of in the hill country landscape. But this theory struggled to explain why no bodies had been found despite intensive searching. The hill country landscape was vast, but not so vast that bodies could remain undetected indefinitely. Eventually, remains would decompose, would become exposed, would be discovered by animals or discovered by people. Yet decades had passed, and no remains of any of the 5 teenagers had ever been discovered. Theory 5. Accident and environmental factors. A fifth theory was that the teenagers had had an accident while hiking or walking through the hill country landscape at night. The theory suggested that perhaps the teenagers had fallen, had been injured, and had not survived their injuries. The theory suggested that perhaps their bodies had been scattered or hidden by wildlife or by natural environmental processes. But this theory also encountered obstacles. While it was possible that bodies might not be discovered, it was unusual that no remains would have been found after decades of searching and after decades of natural decomposition. Additionally, why would the teenagers have abandoned their vehicle and walked into rough terrain at night? This scenario did not fit the available evidence. As the investigation into the disappearance of the 5 teenagers proceeded, weeks became months, and months became years. The investigation produced no breakthrough, no definitive evidence, no clear explanation for what had happened. Police interviewed individuals who had been on Highway 281 that night. Police looked for other vehicles that might have been in the area. Police looked for witnesses who might have seen the teenagers, but no witnesses came forward. No one reported seeing the teenagers or their vehicle. Police investigated the backgrounds of the teenagers to see if there was any hidden conflict or reason why the teenagers might have disappeared, but no such conflict was discovered. The teenagers were well-adjusted, academically successful, socially integrated. Police considered whether there might have been an adult involved, a person who knew the teenagers, who might have been traveling behind them, who might have forced them to abandon their vehicle. But no such person was ever identified. The single shoe that had been discovered was extensively analyzed. Forensic specialists attempted to extract evidence from the shoe, hair, fiber, DNA, but the analysis did not provide definitive information about what had happened. The families of the 5 teenagers were devastated by the disappearance. All 5 teenagers had been their children. All 5 teenagers had had their entire lives ahead of them. The sudden disappearance of these 5 young people was incomprehensible tragedy. For James Mitchell's parents, Edward and Patricia, the disappearance of their son was devastating. James had been their only child. He had been successful, talented, loved. His future had seemed bright. Suddenly, he was gone. His parents spent the years following his disappearance attempting to understand what had happened. They maintained contact with the families of the other teenagers. They participated in efforts to keep the case alive. For Sarah Henderson's parents, the disappearance of their daughter was similarly devastating. They had watched their daughter grow and succeed. They had been proud of her accomplishments. They had been looking forward to seeing her attend Rice University. Now she was gone. Additionally, they had experienced the pain of knowing that their daughter had been with James Mitchell when he disappeared. The 2 teenagers they had watched grow up together had now vanished together. For Michael Torres's parents, Antonio and Rosa, the disappearance of their son was particularly painful because of what it represented. They had sacrificed so much to provide Michael with opportunities, They had worked hard to create a better life for their family. They had been so proud of Michael's accomplishments. Now their son was gone, and they were left with the uncertainty and the grief. For Lisa Garrett's parents, the disappearance of their daughter was devastating. Lisa had been a strong person, a leader, someone who seemed capable of handling anything. Yet she had disappeared into the hill country landscape. Her parents spent years struggling to understand what had happened to their daughter. For David Chen's parents, David Sr. and Lisa, the disappearance of their son was a nightmare. They had immigrated to the United States for David's benefit, to provide him with opportunities. They had sacrificed tremendously. Now their son was gone. Their dreams for his future had been erased. The families banded together in their search for answers. They organized search parties. They distributed flyers. They appeared on television and in newspapers appealing for information. They maintained contact with each other. They supported each other through their shared grief. The disappearance of the 5 teenagers remained in cold case files. The case remained officially open, but active investigation was gradually reduced. Other cases demanded law enforcement attention. The investigation transitioned from an active search to an archived cold case. Over the decades that followed, the case occasionally received media attention. Documentaries examined the case. Television programs discussed the disappearance. Journalists attempted to solve the mystery. Internet forums discussed theories, but no definitive answer was ever produced. In the 1980s, new investigative techniques became available. Police pursued new leads using these techniques, but the techniques did not produce breakthrough evidence. In the 1990s, DNA analysis became available. Police hoped that this new technology might provide answers. The single shoe that had been discovered decades earlier was re-examined using DNA analysis. But DNA analysis requires known samples to compare against. The analysis did not produce definitive results that would identify what had happened to the teenagers. In the 2000s, genetic genealogy became available as an investigative tool. Police looked into whether genetic genealogy might provide information about individuals in the area at the time of the disappearance. But genetic genealogy requires DNA from family members to be present in databases. No matches emerged that would suggest foul play. In the years and decades that followed the disappearance, the families of the 5 teenagers maintained their search for answers. The families aged. Some family members passed away without ever knowing what had happened to their loved ones. James Mitchell's parents, Edward and Patricia, aged throughout the decades. Edward Mitchell Sr. eventually passed away in 1993, more than 15 years after his son's disappearance, without ever knowing what had happened to James. Patricia Mitchell lived longer, surviving until 2001. Throughout her life, she participated in efforts to keep James's case alive. She maintained contact with the families of the other teenagers. She spoke to anyone who would listen about her son. Sarah Henderson's parents similarly aged. They lived into their 80s and 90s. They continued to discuss their daughter's disappearance. They maintained Sarah's memory through family gatherings and through personal remembrance. Michael Torres' parents spent their final years grieving the loss of their son. They had worked so hard to provide opportunity for Michael, and yet the opportunity had been cut short by his disappearance. Lisa Garrett's parents experienced the particular pain of losing a child when they had expected her to continue the family ranch operations and to carry forward the family legacy. David Chen's parents experienced the pain of losing their son at the moment when he was about to achieve the intellectual success that they had sacrificed so much to make possible. The siblings of the 5 teenagers also experienced profound grief. They had been friends with the missing teenagers, or in some cases, they had known the missing teenagers through the family's connections. They grew to adulthood with the awareness that their siblings' friends or acquaintances had disappeared and were never found. As decades passed following the disappearance of the 5 teenagers, the impact of the case extended across generations. The teenagers who had disappeared in 1976 would now be in their 60s if they were still alive. They would have had children and grandchildren. They would have pursued their careers. But none of that had happened. The families of the teenagers had children and grandchildren. These children and grandchildren grew up aware of the tragic disappearance of their relatives. They grew up knowing that 5 teenagers had vanished without explanation. This knowledge became part of the family narrative, part of the family history. The community of the Texas Hill Country had been affected by the disappearance. The event had marked the community. People who lived in the region decades later would still be aware of the disappearance. It had become part of the region's identity and history. In 2025, Nearly 50 years after the disappearance of the 5 teenagers, the case remains unsolved. The case remains officially open, but active investigation has essentially concluded. The file remains in cold case archives, waiting for evidence that may never emerge. What happened to James Mitchell, Sarah Henderson, Michael Torres, Lisa Garrett, and David Chen? This question remains unanswered. Did they have an accident? Were they abducted? Did they intentionally disappear? Were they murdered? No definitive answer exists. Where are the 5 teenagers? Are they still in the Texas Hill Country landscape? Their remains hidden in some remote location? Are they somewhere else entirely? Were they transported away from the location? No definitive answer exists. What does the single shoe represent? It is the only physical trace of the teenager's fate. It suggests that at least one teenager traveled away from the vehicle, but it raises more questions than it answers. What happened to that teenager? What happened to the other 4? The families continue to search. They continue to hope that eventually, information will emerge that will provide closure and answers. But with each passing year, the possibility of finding living teenagers has transitioned to the possibility of at least recovering remains so that families can have closure. The Texas Hill Country landscape, through which the teenagers drove on that night in May 1976, continues to keep its secrets. The landscape is beautiful, but it is also a landscape that can conceal mysteries. It can hide evidence. It can swallow secrets. And the disappearance of 5 teenagers remains one of the most profound secrets that the Texas Hill Country keeps.